and we titled the series, Did You See God? And really the idea behind the series is most of us are pretty good at seeing God in the good things in our life. Most of us are pretty good. When I say, hey, where have you seen God lately? Like, you think of the areas that he's blessed you, or ever. If you're, kind of on the fence with Christianity and Jesus, like you would at least start to look for God and like, well, where are the good things in my life? Why haven't more good things occurred in my life? Here's what we're not good at. Most of us, especially, those of us who are Christians, we're usually not that good at recognizing God when life sucks. We're usually not that good at seeing what God is doing in our lives and around us when life is not well and when we don't get the things that we want and when we feel like God isn't answering our prayers. And as a matter of fact, Joseph, the guy who we've been studying this month, he experiences a life that most of us would never sign up for. He has a dysfunctional family. He is sold into slavery. He spends time in prison. He is abandoned. He is lonely. And yet, at the end of his life, he makes some statements that we're going to look at in a couple minutes that basically say, I've seen God all over my life. Like God has literally orchestrated every part of my life. And it's very easy to look at that statement. And, I guess maybe for some of us, we look at that statement and you can go like, well, no, God actually hasn't been there because your life sucked. For others of us, we can look at the statement and maybe just kind of glamorize it and be like, wow, like look at his faith. But it doesn't really translate to us and our own experience of life. And how do we handle difficulties and challenging circumstances? Where do we see God in our life? Because I think, to be honest, for those of us who, for everyone in the room, you're gonna get closer to God and you're gonna follow Jesus better simply the more you see him. The more you don't see God, the more that you don't see God involved in your life. And some of you, you're like, bro, I've literally never seen God. That's why I don't believe in him. Like, yeah, that's what I mean. If you don't see God, if you don't see his activity in your life, you're probably not going to follow him for very long, or you're probably not going to follow him definitely when life gets difficult. And I said at the beginning of the series, I'm not suggesting that you should see a physical, visible, entity in the sky or show up in your room or whatever. If that's what you want, that sounds scary to me, but good luck. And you can ask for it. There are stories of it. But I think that the Christian faith is even better than that. And we have a legacy of people who testify to seeing God, but they don't see an entity, they see activity. They see the activity, they see activity in their life that they can only explain by going, that was God. That was God orchestrating events to bless me, to care for me, to provide for me. And it's a skill that, to be honest, the better you get at it, the better your relationship with Jesus will be, the better Christian you'll be. And I even think the better life that you'll have as you discover more and more that there is someone who knows you intimately, knows every detail of your life, cares about you immensely, and is trying to be more involved in your life for your growth and for your good. And that's what we've been kind of exploring over the course of this series. Did you see God? So I'm going to jump into it today. And I'll just jump straight into it. If you haven't learned this already, I want to show you the narrative arc of pretty much every story that you're going to read about or that you're going to read about, the movie that you're going to watch. We'll throw a graphic up on the screen. This is the narrative arc of every story. There are basically 5 parts to it. Like I said, if you haven't already, you'll learn this one day in English class. Most movies that you like, most shows that you like, most books that you read, they're going to follow this basic format. In the beginning, there's an exposition, and I'll give you an example of this as we make our way through the story. The beginning of the story, there's an exposition, right? So you're introduced to the main characters in the story, and you get a little bit of background of who they are and what they're like and what they do. And then you have the rising action. The rising action, the characters start to interact, right? So in this potential hypothetical example, you have 2 people from different spaces, and now they're dating, and one of them put the other one on the map, and it's like this really, really cool, love story. Okay, this story is still unfolding before our eyes. So if you were to hypothesize about how does this story end up working itself out, well, the summit would be when they get married. In a relationship, in any love story, the summit is when they commit to each other for the rest of their life. And, there's all this excitement. There's all this vision for the future. The summit is the resolution of all the rising action that we've seen so far. And then, the falling action, the resolution, that's the happily ever after. That's the little Kelseys of the world running around, catching passes, singing songs, and just doing amazing things, right? This is the way most stories work. And at the end of the story is usually the happily ever after. Most stories that we watch, there is some kind of like, okay, it's over And now we see them ride off into the sunset. And whether it was a good story or a bad story, there's a close. The story of Joseph, it starts off following this same format, okay? It starts off, the exposition of Joseph is him, the dysfunctional family, the dream that God gives him. The starting point is like, okay, we see where this is going. Then you see the rising action. You see him sold into slavery. You see him abandoned in jail. And then you get to the summit. And when you get to the summit, this is what we talked about last week, what Evan talked about last week. You see Joseph given a chance to actually speak to Pharaoh, to the ruler of Egypt. And Joseph is given a chance to now step into second in command in Egypt. He becomes one of the most successful and influential people in this region of the world. This is the dreams fulfilled. God told him, I'm gonna make you influential. I'm gonna make you successful. And we see Joseph start to step into that. This looks like the summit of the story. This looks like the part where the next thing that we read, it should be, oh, Joseph lived happily ever after and he ruled in Egypt. God fulfilled the dream. God turned the bad things around. But that's not what we read. No, after the summit, if you keep reading Joseph's story, you actually see 8 chapters of more chaos and confusion. You don't get this quick resolution. You get even more family drama. And this picture, I think it actually illustrates a reality about life. And that is your problems don't go away when you become successful. Your problems do not go away when you achieve your dreams. I think when you're young, because for many of us in the room, you'd probably say that you want more than you have. You want more things to change about your life than ultimately when you think of the dream life for yourself. Many of us want a relationship. Many of us want a successful career. Many of us want more money. Like if you had to kind of dream up your life, there are a lot of things that we want. There are a lot of dreams that we have for the future. And to be clear, like I hope you get them all. But one of the mistakes that people fall into, not just young people, all people, one of the mistakes that a lot of people fall into is believing that once I accomplish my dreams, then I'll be happy and then I won't have all the problems that I currently have. And unfortunately, that's just not how life works. Right now, if you got everything that you wanted, if you got your dream life, if everything about your life changed today and you got your dream life, you would actually, I know you might find this difficult to believe, but you would still have some of the very same problems you face today. Some of the same insecurities would be present, some of the same anxieties, some of the same fears. The depression would still find a way to creep back up again because our situation is never going to actually satisfy our soul. There is not a version of life where you design your life so perfectly and all your relationships are great and everything that you do is great and you're really talented and you're really successful. There's not a version of life where you design everything so well that your soul is at rest, because that's just not how life works. That's not even how humans work. And Joseph is about to discover that. Joseph has become the most successful, the most influential, one of the wealthiest individuals in his part of the world. But for some reason, the author tells us the story is not over. Apparently, God actually wants more for your life than just success. That in God's dream, in God's vision for your life, it's not just that you're wealthy and happy. Like, sure, I hope you get it. But God actually wants more. I want to show you how the story continues right after Joseph elevates to success in Egypt. The beginning of chapter 42 says this. Says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt. So remember, Jacob is Joseph's dad. So he's going back to his family. Joseph's dad learned that there was grain in Egypt. He said to his sons, Joseph's brothers, why do you just keep looking at each other? He continued, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. The author of Joseph's story has just spent the past 5 chapters. He's narrating Joseph's life. He's telling us about this influential figure who we're supposed to learn some things from and learn some things to not do, right? He's telling us about him and he goes, he records Joseph's rise to fame. He records Joseph's kind of rise to power, all the struggle that he had, and he gets to this summit of success. This moment where now Joseph looks like he's living in the dream, where now Joseph is successful and happy. And the author goes, by the way, do you remember the dysfunctional family that he came from? Joseph still has to work through that. Wait, Joseph's really successful now. Like I thought, this is how we would design our story. It's like, wait, I thought he kind of achieved everything he wanted to. Well, yeah, but he still has to address the relationships that are broken. And if I can just be honest with you, I talk to young people sometimes, and I'll listen to issues that they have, maybe with family members, maybe with parents. And sometimes a student will express to me how much they want to get away from mom and dad, particularly after graduation, right? Because for some of us, that's like the finish line. Once I'm 18, once I graduate, I can get away. And some people, I've talked to students who they have a plan. They have a vision for how this is gonna work out. Once I'm 18, I can move out, I can go to college, I can get this job, I can get this roommate. I no longer will have to put up with all the stuff that I'm currently putting up with in my home that I don't like. And hear me clearly, I wanna be sympathetic because I know that there are some really difficult circumstances that are represented in this room. But you can't just run from relationships forever. Some of you, your default when you face problems in relationships, whether it's friendships, whether it's family, some of you, your default is to just run away from the relationship because you just don't know how to address the problem. How many of us have friendships that have ended because someone said something, because there was kind of a smaller problem, but no one knew how to say I'm sorry. No one knew how to extend forgiveness. No one knew how to get over an offense. No one knew how to just have a difficult, uncomfortable conversation. So as a result, this little insignificant thing has now just cost us a relationship. We are no longer close to that person. We no longer talk to that person because we just ran away. How many times do some of us get in fights with our parents? And we get so upset, and internally, maybe we won't say it out loud, but internally, we just look forward to the day I don't have to be here anymore. Man, once I'm out and I don't have to put up with this, I'm gonna be free. For those of us, some of us, our natural reaction in relationships that get difficult is to just run away. And Joseph gets so far away. He gets so far away from the dysfunctional relationships that he had to deal with growing up. He reaches success, and then all of a sudden he realizes, oh, I guess I just can't run forever. That again, in God's version of success, in God's vision for your life, it's not just money and house and cars and influence, but he actually deeply cares about your relationships. He actually deeply cares about how you treat people, about how you resolve the conflict in your life, about how you get along with people who have hurt you and people who have maybe wronged you. Like, how do you think about them in your heart? It's something that God wants to address with Joseph. So chapter 42, it introduces us to the next part of the story. And if I could just briefly summarize a couple chapters, because I don't have time to cover everything. I'm gonna have to leave a lot out, but Joseph is he's ruling in Egypt. I'll get to that in just a second. Joseph is ruling in Egypt, and because he has correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dream, which is what Evan talked about last week, he predicted that 7 years of food was 7 years, the empire was gonna have a lot of food. The crops were gonna be great. So they store up food for 7 years. For 7 years, they store up food. And they build these resources, and then after those 7 years, there's a famine in the land. And that's really difficult for us to kind of understand the magnitude of, because we're also used to there being food when we need there to be food, right? Like we all know when I drive up to McDonald's, they're gonna have food. They might not have ice cream, but they're gonna have food. And the author of the story, he tells us Joseph is living in Egypt. He has just stored up food for 7 years. And now the rest of the land is starting to experience the famine, which is why when we read a moment ago, Dad tells his brothers they're living away from Egypt. Dad tells the sons, hey guys, this famine is looking bad. And again, we don't understand the magnitude of it. If their crops don't grow, they don't eat. And if they don't eat, they die. This is actually a life or death situation. We need to figure this out. So Dad tells the brothers, hey, you guys are not taking the famine seriously enough. Go to Egypt. I've heard they have food. So the brothers go down to Egypt to get food, and sure enough, the person they have to stand before and ask for food is Joseph, because he has now elevated himself to a position of authority and influence. Now, there's a lot that happens between chapters 42 and 50. Again, I got to leave stuff out just for the sake of time. But for a while, when Joseph interacts with his brothers, they don't even recognize him because it has been 20 years. It's been over 20 years. Joseph actually speaks to them through an interpreter. They speak different languages. Joseph very likely looks different. He very likely looks a lot more Egyptian than the rest of his brothers because he's been in a different environment. But eventually, in chapter 45, the unveiling happens and Joseph's brothers realize it's him. And that's the part of the story that I want to pick up on and that I want us to consider today. The beginning of chapter 45 says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendees, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence." We'll leave that one there for just a second. Obviously, they were terrified. They had every right to be terrified. This is the same brother who they beat up, threw into a pit, and then sold into slavery. And by the way, their relational history even before that moment is that they never liked him. This is the guy they mistreated, they abused, and whose life they have ruined. Now they see him, and he's second in charge of the largest empire in the region. Joseph has soldiers who report to him. Joseph, this is his moment to let them know how wrong they were. This is his moment to get them back for everything that they did. This is his moment to make them feel exactly what they made him feel. If you think about the people in your life who have caused you the most pain and the most problems, Joseph is now standing face to face with them, and he gets to do whatever he wants. He finally gets his moment of revenge. And here's what Joseph says. Verse 4, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here.'" Wait. Don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves. Joseph, you were a slave because of them. You were abandoned in jail because of them. Why would you say to them, "Hey, don't beat yourselves up about it. Don't be angry at yourselves"? Joseph goes on, says, "Don't be angry at yourselves, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." 2 more verses. Joseph keeps going. "For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." It was not you, but God. Please do not miss the magnificence of this moment. The betrayed person forgives the betrayer, forgives their betrayer. The good guy forgives all the bad guys because apparently, somehow, Joseph looked at his life and he said, "Yeah, it wasn't you guys. It was actually God who was orchestrating my life." And here's the lesson that I want us to learn from this man today. When Joseph looks at his brothers and he says, "Guys, don't be mad at yourselves," right? Hey, don't be angry at yourselves. Don't be distressed. Don't beat yourselves up for that moment. When Joseph says that, there's a part of me as I read the story and I'm like, Joe, they ruined your life. You just experienced 2 decades of not good because of their one decision. How can you say that God has actually been there for you through it all? Well, if you notice, Joseph didn't just look at what God was doing for him. Joseph paid attention to what God was doing through him. For many of us, if we had to describe how we've seen God work in our lives, like I said a moment ago, we would just start to list all the good things in our life. all the times when God answered the prayer, all the things that God has given us, the house, the roof over our head, the shoes on our feet, the food, the time where God came through and he did that thing for my parents, or maybe even for me where I experienced him. To be clear, the scripture says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. So I think it's really important that we recognize all the good things that we have are actually gifts from him for those of us who are Jesus followers. But if the only way we know how to see God is through all the good things in our life, what do we do when our family is going through a divorce? What do we do when life isn't turning out the way that we want it to? What do we do when we face things like Joseph, things like betrayal and loneliness, rejection, just difficult seasons? How do we see God when life is not good? According to Joseph, I'll say it this way: when you can't see what God is doing for you, pay attention to what God is doing through you. When you can't see what God is doing for you, pay attention to what God is doing through you. Some of you, you feel like God hasn't done a lot of the stuff that you want him to, but you don't even realize that in this difficult season, God is growing you into a person, growing you into the person he has actually created you to be. Right now, some of you don't have the friendships that you want. You don't have those relationships that you want, but God is actually asking you to be a friend to someone else who you don't even think is that cool, because in this season, you are now learning what it feels like to not have anyone, and you're gonna be a way better friend because of it. Some of you haven't had the success that you want, whether it's academics, athletics, influence, whatever it is, you haven't had the success that you want, and it's frustrating. But God is actually forming you into someone who doesn't give up easy. Someone who's resilient, someone who's going to be able to encourage others in that spot one day. Some of you don't even realize that as you go through a difficult season, God is actually forming you into someone who can help others go through their difficult seasons. And that's why I will always do my best to help anyone with any issue that they're going through. But there are certain subjects that when they come up, I raise my hand really quick because I know exactly what that's like. When things like anxiety come up, I'll raise my hand really fast. Hey, I have been there. I have gone through a process of trying to heal, of trying to figure out, why do I panic in certain rooms? Why can I not stay calm when I feel like I should be able to? When disappointment with life, disappointment with where you're at in life, when that comes up, I'll raise my hand really fast. Hey, I am walking through navigating how do I deal with the disappointments in my life? Things like loneliness, man, I'll put my hand up. I get it. I have had seasons where I felt like there is not one person who is there. We have people on our team who have lived through depression, who have lived through broken families, who have lived through relational breakdowns and toxic environments, like you name it. We have people on our team, people who are here every single Sunday who have lived through it. But instead of looking at their difficult season and going, well, God wasn't there, God didn't do what I wanted him to do, they've actually recognized that even when they couldn't see what God was doing for them, that they saw what God was doing through them. That God was turning them into people who are more compassionate, people who are more courageous, people who actually live more like Jesus. And God wants to do the same thing in your life. You see, if you can get better at recognizing what God is doing in you as a person, how he's growing you, how he's maturing you, if you can get better at seeing that, I think you can live a life a little bit more like Joseph. A life that doesn't give up on God when things get difficult. A life that forgives people and isn't plagued by bitterness and hate and anger, but a life that actually somehow sees God in everything. So here's my recommendation, because I've said this before, right? When we get in settings like this, like I can talk and I can tell stories, and hopefully you find a little bit of encouraging and illuminating. But if you walk out of here and you don't do anything about it, it doesn't change how you actually treat people, how you relate to God. Like that's it. Then it's just going to be one story, one little teaching that you heard. Here's my recommendation. I've done this before. My recommendation is that everyone in this room, that at some point in the next couple days, you take like 10 minutes. And by the way, if you actually show up on group nights, if you show up on Wednesday nights, we're gonna do this in our groups. So you just wait until then. But everybody, you take 10 minutes and you just write down all the moments where you have seen God show up in your life. And I want you to think of everything. I want you to think of all the things that he's provided for you. I want you to think of all the things that he's done for your family. I want you to think of the ways that he has grown you, the person that you are today, how God has actually been there with you, been there with it through you, and how he has formed you into someone who now, wherever you've struggled, you're better able to help other people. Write it all down. Not too long ago, I was going through a situation where I was really afraid and I was really overwhelmed about some challenges and some difficulties that I was facing. And I did this. I wrote down, I got out my journal and I just wrote down everything that that I've seen God do in my own life, that I have recognized, God, that was you at work. And when you do it, I really believe it'll give you faith. It'll give you faith. It'll help you open up your eyes to recognize how involved God has been and how committed God wants to be to your life, how committed he is to your life. That if we would become people who just get better at recognizing, oh, you have been there and you are here. And man, I think this is a skill that we got to practice, because very often God doesn't always show up the way that we think he should, or in the moment that we really want him to show up. And he doesn't always do the thing that we initially asked for. And the temptation so often is to just step back from life, step back from faith. Maybe you still got to show up because you still got to attend church or whatever it is. But in your heart of hearts, you're going like, no. Some of you, the reason that you don't want to follow Jesus is because you think God is asking you to do things and he hasn't done anything for you. And if I can just encourage you as I close, the story of Joseph, it's encouraging. The story of Joseph is ultimately supposed to point us to the story of Jesus. Whenever you read anything in the Old Testament, the first 3/4 of our Bible, whenever you read any story there, that story is not supposed to just be a standalone story. Yes, we can look at stories and we can take lessons from them and we can learn things from heroic figures for sure. But ultimately, all those stories are a chain or are a link in the chain that leads us to the person of Jesus. And when you want to talk about, hey, what does it look like to live a life of suffering for the good of other people? What does it look like to actually go through pain, go through difficulties, go through trials, and somehow be a blessing to other people? Like Joseph saves Egypt, Jesus, we believe, saves people. That Jesus would go through the cross, that he would go into death, all so that you and I would experience grace. Also that you and I would experience love. And I'm going to end by just reading one verse. And we don't have this one, Devin, sorry. But I'm going to end by just reading one verse, because this is how the book of Genesis ends. This is how Joseph's story ends. Joseph and his brothers have now, they've reconciled. The brothers have really tried to make sure that they're not going to have any problems anymore. And this is one of the last things that Joseph says. Joseph tells his brothers, the same ones who betrayed him, threw him into slavery, all of it. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. Joseph is very aware of what role everyone played. Hey, I know what you meant to do. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You meant one thing for my life. People meant one thing for your life. And yet Joseph is able to go, but God has actually been the one who has been orchestrating my life, providing for my life, giving me the courage, giving me the encouragement. Joseph was able to recognize God in everything. And I think we'll get better at that the more that we pay attention.